Single sign-on and third-party authentication. So this falls under the problem of design patterns in our applications. And it's something where almost every application that you build at some point, many applications that you build will at some point require a user to log in. And so the goal here is to be able to ask questions about how can I have users do something without having to know all their details. So if you're building an application, you could say, which of your Facebook friends are reading something on the New York Times website? The way that authentication works is that the New York Times needs to sort of be able to access your Facebook info. So if we're the New York Times trying to say, who else is reading, perhaps to post comments, share articles, you can log into Facebook, but you don't want to reveal your Facebook password or any other application password to the New York Times. And it turns out that we've all probably used these flows a million times before. And so third-party authentication provides a way of sharing data between applications without having to reveal the most sensitive user data. So there are two principles that are really useful to distinguish and sometimes easy to mix up. So what we're really going to deal with today is authentication. Authentication is prove who you are and who you say you are. So commonly, username and password are ways of providing that authentication. If you're two servers talking to each other, you could hold some private key that matches some public key. So if you've taken a cryptography class, perhaps you'll know about RSA, which allows two computers to prove who they are. And of course, you could pre-agree on cryptographic secrets by trusted third parties. So if you're connecting, to Amazon in a server, Amazon has a certificate for the database that you can load into an application that says, this thing is exactly Amazon's server. The second problem that third-party authentication can help with that we're not going to address right now is authorization, which is prove that you're allowed to do what you're asking. So authentication is who are you? And authorization is can you do what you're trying to do? We can ask this by, does the system record you as having some particular privilege? Or does it say, do you have a token to access some particular kind of service? Third-party authentications provide both of these. If you've ever logged into a system like CalNet with your CalNet credentials, where you put in your username and password, CalNet will tell whatever system, whether that's Gradescope or edX or something else, that you're a student or a faculty member or an alumni, and that grants you certain permissions perhaps in that system. So in the old days, and still today, right, websites have separate passwords, but if they don't provide a RESTful API, you don't have any way of accessing that kind of data or to simulate it. You would have to provide your username and password to a service to access that data. So in a service-oriented architecture approach, this really doesn't work, right? It's hard for services to cooperate with each other. If you've ever used financial tracking services, like that manage budgets where you would log into multiple bank accounts, the banks were the last kind of organizations to implement this kind of procedure. So you used to actually have to pass your banking credentials to a budgeting application for it to properly track your bank accounts. And obviously, that's not a preferred system. So the desired pattern here is to have a standard protocol for what we call single sign-on, how I pass data from service A to service B without revealing my credentials along the way. And so how do we think about third-party authentication? If you saw on the demo, there was a login with GitHub button, so that's the example that we're going to use. But really, this works with any number of third-party services that allow us to. So we have our sort of rotten potato icon here. So if I say login with GitHub on our service, what Rotten Potatoes will do is it'll automatically redirect me to the GitHub application. And so what you'll see as a user is the domain name will change. You will be on github.com or the NewYorkTimes.com or whatever other service. And inside there, GitHub is going to say, is it okay to authorize this application to access some data or to use your credentials? Typically, you only need to do this once, right? If you've ever logged in with your Google account into some service, it says like, do you want to authorize, something to access your Google Drive or your Google Calendar? You'll typically see that the first time. If you've used Codio and authorized with GitHub, you've probably gone through this particular flow. And then what happens is if you answer yes, you tell on the GitHub site, you tell GitHub that you want to. GitHub then redirects you back to your Rotten Potatoes app. Behind the scenes, it bundles up things like an authentication token, info about perhaps your username, maybe your email address. The specifics depend on each application. And what you get back in the end of this is a particular secret token that Rotten Potatoes could use to perhaps access your GitHub account if that's what you allow it to do, or it could just include some particular information about the user. And then hopefully at the end of this, what it will say is, welcome back, and so on. And so this third-party authentication flow, it feels like a lot of steps, but when implemented right, it happens transparently to the users.